Hi friends, today we are going to be engaged in a digital reading thinking activity about the Turning Pages by Sonia Sotomayor and illustrated by Lulu DeClaire. A digital DRTA is a strategy where we will be able to answer questions before, during, and after the book is read. Students will be able to make a prediction about the story based on the pictures. They will also modify their original predictions while reading the story. Before we begin, we are going to look at some illustrations and try to predict what the book might be about. By looking at the cover, what do you think the book may be about? On page 1 and 2, where do you think those characters are at? On page 3 and 4, how do you think the characters are feeling in this picture? On page 5, why is there feet under the car? On page 6, what do you think the character is implying by the comic strip? On page 7, what do you think the character is doing? On page 8, why is the character reading a story? On page 9, who do you think those people are? On page 10, where is the character at and why is the character in a sailboat? What is the sailboat made out of? On page 11 and 12, how do you think the characters feel looking at all the books? On page 13, what do you think the character is doing? On page 14, where do you think the character is going? On page 15 and 16, why do you think the character is up in space? On page 17 and 18, what do you think is going on? On page 19 and 20, where do you think the character is at now, and what do you think the character is doing? On page 21 and 22, what kind of building do you think that is? On page 23 and 24, why do you think there are cutouts of paper under the buildings? On page 25 and 26, what do you think those signs mean? On page 27, where do you think the character is going? On page 28, what do you think that is a picture of? And on page 29 and 30, what do you think is going on and who do you think that is a puzzle of? Now we are going to read the story. While reading, think about all the predictions we had just made. My life story is a story about books, of poems and comics, of law and mystery, of science and science fiction, written both in Spanish and in English. Even though I was born and grew up in New York City, Spanish was the language we spoke at home, the language of Puerto Rico, the island where my family came from. I struggled to learn English. Balancing two languages in my head wasn't always easy, but books made learning fun. Reading was like lighting candles, each book a flame that lit up the world around me. What was so special about books? Do written words have a unique magic? At each step in my life, I would put together the answers like pieces to a puzzle. We now learned that the characters were in New York City, but we still don't know where exactly the characters are at. Were our predictions correct? My first memory of the power of words came from my abuelita, my beloved grandmother. Every Saturday, my aunts and uncles and cousins would gather for a party at home. After we ate dinner, the crowded little room would get quiet. Abuelita would close her eyes and recite poems written long ago about the tropical land our family had left behind. The words she spoke sent a charge through the room and sparked memories of her faraway island home. I didn't know how to read yet, but written words I discovered were electrical currents that jolted feelings to life. We learned that the characters are feeling memorable of past memories. Were our predictions correct? When I was 7, I got sick and was diagnosed with diabetes. I was so afraid of the big needle used to take my blood for testing at the hospital that I ran outside and hid under a parked car. I also learned that I would have to get shots every day to stay alive. All those needles were very scary. We now learned that the feet under the car were the main character's feet and how she felt when she was diagnosed with diabetes. Were our predictions correct? We learned the comic strip meant her courage and how she could save the world. Were our predictions correct? I may have been inspired by Supergirl, but I still needed to use an airplane if I wanted to fly. When we took trips from the cold concrete streets of the Bronx to sunny Puerto Rico, I ate fresh mangoes that had just fallen off the trees, sipped juice straight from the coconut, and marveled at the shimmer of tiny glowing creatures in the bay at night. But my favorite time was siesta at my aunt's home in Mayaguez. At lunchtime, we feasted on rice and beans and chicken spiced with sofrito, a delicious mixture of tomatoes, onions, garlic, and peppers. Then bellies stuffed full, all my aunts and uncles and cousins would settle down for a nap in the peaceful quiet of a hot afternoon. We learned that the character is not doing anything but thinking about and fantasizing her trips from the cold concrete streets of the Bronx to Puerto Rico. Were our predictions correct? Their nap time was my reading time. I had my trusty books to keep me company. Books were my loyal friends. They made it so I never felt lonely. We learned the character is reading a story because it was what she liked to do during their nap time. Books made her feel as though she was never lonely. Were our predictions correct? When I was 9 years old, my father, Poppy, who had been sick for a long time, passed away. I felt sad and confused, and my home was filled with gloom, but I discovered a place where I could feel comfort. All summer long at the nearby Parkchester Library, I walked through the aisles and touched the musty volumes until one book after another caught my eye. I read as many books as I could. I wanted to read them all. We learned that those people are her family and father, Poppy, who had passed away, and how she felt when he did. Were our predictions correct? I was lucky to have a library that was in my neighborhood, walking distance from home. For hours, I could sail away to the wondrous lands in the stories I would choose from the stacks. The library was my harbor, and books were little boats that helped me escape sadness at home. We learned the character is in a library and is in a sailboat because when reading, it makes her sail away to wondrous lands in the stories. Were our predictions correct? Leaving home, though, was the farthest thought from my mind the day a delivery man rang our apartment doorbell, hauling 2 huge heavy boxes. "What's inside?" my brother Juan and I asked, and Mommy, my mother, told us to look. Tearing open the packing tape, we discovered an entire encyclopedia. There were 24 massive books, each unveiling secrets about the world. From the tiniest atoms to the tallest mountains, from the hottest deserts to the frozen tundra, Mommy had created a library in her very own home. We learned that the characters are feeling excited and curious while looking at all the books. Were our predictions correct? Back on land, Nancy drew the young girl detective hero in dozens of books, fired my imagination. Her make-believe life was so different from mine. She lived in a big house on a tree-lined street and partnered with her dad, a successful lawyer, to solve crimes. Despite our differences, I would doze off picturing myself in Nancy's shoes. Could I figure out mysteries too? We learned the character is dozing off and picturing herself in Nancy's shoes. Were our predictions correct? Books were a time machine inspiring me to imagine what I would be when I grow up. We learned the character was going down the stairs, imagining what she would be when she grew up. Were our predictions correct? When we moved to a bigger apartment in the Bronx, our new home wasn't anything like Nancy Drew's, but Juan and I did finally get our own small rooms. It was really just one larger bedroom divided by a thin wall, but we each got to decorate our rooms. I chose wallpaper with pictures of the constellations in the sky. I loved reading science fiction books about journeys into deep space, time travel, and encounters with aliens. Even more amazing, real-life astronauts had just landed on the moon. They left behind a gift of words, messages of peace from the countries back on Earth. I read everything I could about the moon landing. If that was possible, then anything I could imagine was possible too. Books were my launch pad, blasting me straight into my dreams. We learned the character is imagining being up in space like launch pad blasting her straight into her dreams. Were our predictions correct? As I got older and read more, my future slowly started to take shape like a ball of clay that you carefully sculpt into a figure with your fingers. In high school, my teacher assigned my class a book about boys on a deserted island who went wild because there were no rules. The boys hurt each other in the chaos of a land without laws. This book opened my eyes. I saw why people need laws and rules to feel safe, so that people have the freedom to grow and flourish. I did not yet know that I would end up working in law as a lawyer and later as a judge, but I was learning why laws matter. Books were lenses bringing into focus truths about the world around me. We learned that she is reading a story that opened up her eyes about the laws. Were our predictions correct? The Bible, a special book we studied at my Catholic high school, taught me lessons about how to treat my neighbors. In one story, Jesus was approached by a crowd ready to punish a woman who had done wrong. Instead, Jesus challenged them, saying, "He that is without sin among you, let him first cast a stone at her." His calm, powerful words made people think. Slowly and silently, the people let her be and went home. I learned that we shouldn't be so quick to judge people who do the wrong things. Sometimes we make mistakes that can hurt someone else, but that doesn't make us bad people. It might just mean we have to say we're sorry, put things right, and try harder. Books were teachers, helping me sort out right from wrong. We learned the characters at her Catholic high school, thinking about how she learned that we shouldn't be so quickly to judge people who do the wrong things. Were our predictions correct? When I started college at Princeton University, the tree-lined paths and old stone buildings looked very different from my neighborhood in the Bronx. I was excited to be there, but I was homesick, and sometimes I felt like I was drowning in everything I didn't know. I quickly discovered the massive Firestone Library, where I could find books on everything. It was so much bigger than my neighborhood library. I would study for hours to catch up. I even improved my writing using grammar books. Books became my life preserver, keeping my head above water. We learned that the building is her college, Princeton University. Were our predictions correct? All that reading taught me about the farthest reaches of the planet and even about the little island closest to my heart, Puerto Rico. I read about men and women there who worked hard but were paid very little. I read about how Puerto Rico became a part of the United States of America. Just like in books, my grandfather worked in a cigar factory and got sick from the dust, and my aunt spent long days stitching handkerchiefs. Like many of the Puerto Ricans who came to New York, Mommy had a hard life. She studied for many years to become a nurse and was able to scrimp and save so that her kids, Juan and I, would have a bigger future. Reading had long taught me about the world outside, but now I was seeing in books a reflection of the lives led by my own family. Books were mirrors of my very own universe. We learned that the buildings were Puerto Rico and the cut-up paper under the buildings were her readings about Puerto Rico. Were our predictions correct? When I became a lawyer, I used cases in the law books to convince judges that people on trial were innocent or guilty, how they had done right and where they had gone wrong. Just as my own family story was mirrored in history books about Puerto Rico, I saw that law books reflected real-life stories of people who got in trouble but still needed to be treated fairly in court. Law books were maps to guide us to justice. We learned that those signs are protest signs and how she had saw that her law books reflected on real-life stories. Were our predictions correct? Justice means treating people fairly under the law. It's also the name of what I am now, Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States. We learned that the character is going up the Supreme Court of the U.S. steps. Were our predictions correct? As a justice, I study the most important words in American law, the founding document of our government, the Constitution of the United States, and decide which laws agree with. Every day I borrow from the lessons of law books of the past and write decisions and opinions that will be bound into the law books of the future. Books are keys that unlock the wisdom of yesterday and open the door to tomorrow. We learned that is a picture of the Constitution of the United States. Were our predictions correct? Flame, electricity, magic potion, friend, boat, snorkel, time machine, launch pad, lens, teacher, life preserver, mirror, map, key. The written word has been all these things to me and more for as long as I can remember. Like flagstones on a path, every book I ever read took me the next step I needed to go in school and in life, even if I didn't know exactly where the trail would lead. Piece by piece, my puzzle came together. Where will your journey lead you? We learned that she is explaining that every book she had read led her to where she is now, even if she did not know it at the time. The puzzle is a picture of her. Were our predictions correct? Today we were engaged in a digital reading thinking activity with the book My Life Story, Turning Pages by Sonia Sotomayor and illustrated by Lulu DeClaire. This story was about a girl that had read throughout her whole entire life and took us through her life and how reading made her feel and memories of her past life and how unfair some things in her past were and show how everything she had ever been through and every book she had ever read without knowing throughout her life led her to be a lawyer for the Supreme Court of the United States. Now that we have finished reading the story, let's think about some of the questions we have asked in the beginning. Was our prediction when looking at the cover page correct? Was the book about what we had predicted? You all did a wonderful job predicting what would happen in this book. Even if all our predictions weren't correct, you made adjustments as the story went on. I hope you all enjoyed listening and reading along to this book about Sonia Sotomayor and her life story.